I want to thank everybody for being here. For those who don't know me, my name is Sanjot Mahendale. I'm the chair of the newly incepted PY and Kinmei W. Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. I also teach on the archaeology of Central Asia in the departments of Near Eastern Studies and the group in Buddhist Studies. And I'm very pleased, actually, to have been invited to chair the second panel called Rock Art Revisited, as I have frequently addressed the rock art of the Karakoram region in my class on the art and archaeology of Buddhism. There are many aspects, I think, that challenge the study of petroglyphs beyond the practical issues relating to dating, conservation, and preservation. Is the question, of course, how rock art functions, factors into anthropological, archaeological, and art historical research. How does rock art inform us about the past? Are there dimensions that are common to rock art, or instead should it be treated as locally embedded? In other words, are there broad aspects or broad dimensions to rock art? Of course, the most formidable problem is what is the meaning and purpose of rock art? Even when rock art is easily recognizable, such as in the case of the Buddhist petroglyphs in the Karakoram, which were highlighted in the work by Jason Nealis, we struggle trying to figure out what the artists intended to convey. So I hope that in this panel, some of those questions will be addressed. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, John Vincent Bellezza, who is a senior research fellow with the Tibet Center at the University of Virginia. Today, his talk is entitled Mongolia and the Western Tibetan Plateau in the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age, considering an expanded sphere of cultural interconnectivity in late prehistoric Inner Asia. As you could also have read on the slide. Please help me welcome Dr. Bellezza.
Thank you very much. I'll try to compress this talk as best as I can in 20 minutes. We'll be looking at some of these following matters. A chronology here largely based on uninformed sources. I do have some dates from radiocarbon and AMS analyses, but much of the chronology in Tibetan archaeology is still tenuous. A map of Inner Asia. We don't have a pointer here, but I think everyone is quite familiar. Oh, yes?
Right next to it.
Oh, yes. I think everyone is familiar. You see your Tarim Basin here. This is the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayan range. This, of course, is the subcontinent. The Arctic Ocean, you have Lake Baikal here, Bekash, Khofsgal. So you can see the Mongolia here, the Gobi, and Tarim again, Tibet, just to give you an idea of this area. I mean, interlinked geographically in many respects, though also vast and remote otherwise. Here we see a political map of the region. This entity here, Polity Shangshung, in the western portion of the plateau is known through Tibetan literary sources. Existed in the early 7th century. It is also the name of a culture and a language. It's very difficult to pinpoint, particularly its chronology or its origins. It is one label we have for pre-Buddhist remains on the plateau, though its depth of the antiquity of Shangshung is not well known yet. This is a little bit, now we're moving into the plateau. You can see some of the regions here, all very high. Much of the upper Tibet, this western part of the Tibetan Plateau of about 700,000 square kilometers, averages over 4,600 meters in elevation. People of Tibet, just to give you a little view here of some of the people of this area, Upper Tibet, pastoralists and agriculturalists. We're going to be looking at specific monuments, funerary monuments. There's two major types in Upper Tibet, in the western half of the plateau. One are the arrays of pillars. appended to edifices. These are temple tombs. And I think we're going to begin here. You can see some of the sites I have been surveying. Much of my work is basic reconnaissance. It's all field survey work over the last 25 years or so. I have not been able to do any digging. There's been very little work done on these topics. There has been, of course, some Chinese excavation in far western Tibet, and some in the eastern part of the region, of course in other parts of Tibet also. But archaeology in Tibet is still very much in its infancy. We talked this morning about how so much needs to still be done in Mongolia. The more so is the case in Tibet. This is an artist's reconstruction of what these arrays of pillars would have looked like, with the temple tomb, the mortuary temple, appended to the west side. These structures are often aligned in the cardinal directions or close to the cardinal directions. They're large, monumental, in some cases up to 65 meters in length. They have sophisticated masonry walls and structures. Probably looking at the residential architecture from the same general period, these structures probably, the temple tombs probably had corbelled roofs, all stone corbelled roofs. It seems we don't really know when agriculture came to western Tibet. We know in eastern Tibet that there was, by the work of people like J. Diplome, we know that we have, and others, and a Chinese archaeologist earlier on, that millet, foxtail, and broomcorn both were being cultivated by about 2500 BC in eastern Tibet. We know sometime around 14 or 1600 BC, as best as we know, and the information is still scanty, the western domesticates of barley and wheat appear in Tibet. The earliest agricultural remains we have in any kind of secure context in western Tibet, unfortunately, only go back to the Iron Age, about 400 or 500 BC. So not clear when agriculture came. I would think by looking at the monuments, the pillar forms, the rock art, the artifacts, that there's probably a package of late Bronze Age and Iron Age of cultural aspects that are, that are involved with the introduction of agriculture in these Western domesticates. Just a sidelight, just as in Bill Honeychurch was talking this morning, later on, after 2000 BC, the 1500 BC broomcorn, millet, and the foxtail pretty much disappears from the record, and barley becomes a predominant crop in Tibet. It's theorized, of course, because of climate change as playing a primary role, not necessarily the only role. This is a larger version of the arrays of pillars appended to temple tombs. You can see these are quite grand structures, quite sophisticated architectural plans and presentations. This is an actual version here. This is the largest of the ones I found. I think of 31 of these sites I have surveyed, at least lightly. Unfortunately, we need to do so much more work, and access in Tibet is always a very difficult matter. There are 6 complexes. This is one of the 6 complexes. In total, 10,000 standing stones. The stones are aligned in rows, again, often oriented in the cardinal directions. There's also slab wall networks that extend also in the cardinal directions. These were very sophisticated structures, at least elaborate in that sense, and so we could, the correlate would be that there are certainly complex ideological, symbolic elements involved with the construction and use of such large necropolises. We're going to look at a specific one that I have a date for, at least one aspect of the site. It's known as the talus blanketed red house, the Kangmar Zashak. It's located, as you can see, pretty much in the heart of western Tibet. That red line, I should just tell you a little about that. That's based on the distribution of these 2 major pillar types, walled-in pillars and the pillars appended to mortuary temples that you find in Upper Tibet. And that line, particularly the line on the southeast and west sides, the far north of Tibet, of course, is uninhabited, and there's not much evidence for large structures, or even in the early period. And so we have this distribution, these very distinctive pillar types found nowhere else in this area, reflective of an archaeological culture. This is Kangmar Zashak here, and just in the front of these pillars is a tomb. I happened to arrive there in 2002 after a torrent had cut into a tomb, sliced it in half like you slice butter with a knife, And it exposed human bones. On the surface were foot bones. I've never scratched the surface. I'm really kind of like a bird. I just hover above and see what I can see on the surface. But here were these foot bones, and I extracted several of them, and they were undergone. This is the tomb here that was cleaved open. There's a large gully just in the front of the image. We have these bones yielded a calibrated date, as you can see, in the 10th, 9th, 10th century BC. And that's located, of course, near the pillars. That doesn't necessarily mean that the pillars and tombs were erected in the same period. It's one date. As we know, there are often in large assemblages of radiocarbon dates, outliers, dates that don't quite fit into the pattern. However, when we look at all the evidence in aggregate, and we look at the evidence that my excellent colleagues here are doing in Mongolia, the date for pillar remains in the early first millennium BC are not unreasonable, and they are plausible. Of course, we do need many more dates and much more work to corroborate these this kind of chronology. I mean, I pretty much have worked alone for the last 30 years or so, and with very little official resources or institutional backing, so I was only able to do what I can do. I also work with text and with the people themselves, so that also we'll look at that. That gives us another insight into these monuments. These are the other kind of sui generis pillars, or the pillars erected within the quadrate enclosures. This is an artist's reconstruction of a lone pillar within the walled structure. We see here again another one with multiple pillars. This is this has 50 pillars or so. This is Rokong. Basically Rokong just means tomb in Western Tibet. This site, most of them have between 1 and 10. This is a typical site. You can see the outline of the walls. You can see the pillars. The pillars are in the west. The enclosure often aligned in the cardinal directions, facing east. The broad vistas in this type of monument, and also with the mortuary temples, has broadest vistas as a rule in the east. So you have these wide, profound views looking east towards this rising sun. Another Takpor Doring here, another one of these structures, typical. I think I've surveyed around 100 of these. No one had surveyed these kind of structures before, and really the Chinese, when I publish stuff, then they do a little paper, and they sum things up, basically, to give their kind of imprimatur on it. I would really like to I'm hoping that archaeology will proceed now more rapidly, and that the Chinese and the international collaboration will result. Right now, it's a difficult time to do any kind of work in Tibet for foreigners. You can see the wall here. There's also some of them have a portal, so if you want to call it that, in the east, an opening, an aperture in the perimeter wall. These are 3 particularly well-formed pillars. They're unmarked. These are not deer stones. They do not have any kind of carvings on them. But you can see certain kind of overriding similarities, structurally morphological. They are not deer stones. They are not built by the pre-Scythians. However, I think there were certainly communications between groups all through Inner-Asia, including Upper Tibet. I should just say I work in Upper Tibet, the western half of the plateau, also in northeastern Tibet, which is now subsumed under the Qinghai province of the People's Republic of China. There are also many Eurasian remains and kinship and ties with other areas of Inner Asia, clearly, as you see in Gansu, Qinghai, Shanxi, etc., Inner Mongolia. These are kind of tombs. They're not slab graves of the eastern portion of Mongolia, Transbaikalia, but they have certain morphological characteristics. And when you look at the artifactual assemblage, which we'll do here in a minute, hopefully, you'll see certain resonances, is perhaps the best word. Here we have slab grave structures, and certainly not the same, but when you look at them as groups, you'll see the Tibetan slab grave structures are very, very different. They tend to be larger. The slabs do not project as much from the ground surface. They also seem to be quite shallow. The same with the pillars. When you look at them in aggregate, you can see that they're quite different. They often tend to be smaller. This environment is alpine in nature and desert, and so extremely dry, extremely harsh, high, severe weather. It can snow any month of the year, and it does. And so it seems as though maybe if you want to see it in structural terms, I think that might be useful here, just for a moment. It's an you can see these smaller pillars, these monuments hugging the ground more closely as an adaptation to very severe climatic conditions. I think we don't have much time, so I could dwell on all of these monuments in more depth. We're going to look at the artifacts in a minute. I think that'll probably tell us more. Let's go now to the rock art, because I want to just give you a primer, if you will, on this on cognate monument types, or monuments that share some correspondence morphologically, stylistic. These are the mascoids, if you want to call them that. These anthropomorphic visages, and emblematic form is what I refer to them as. They have very specific shapes. This is a pair, probably made at different times by different carvers. They're quite different than the Okhinev masks and other mascoids you find in the southern Siberia. The ones, however, in Ladakh, which is an area of the plateau adjacent to the west of Upper Tibet, they have much stronger correspondences with the Siberian mascoids. And that it seems that when looking at mascoids alone, and also actually later when we'll look here quickly at the Iron Age animal style, so-called animal style rock art, it's also much more closely aligned to things that are happening in North Inter-Asia, that is in Ladakh. And this seems to indicate, at least as one possibility, that there were transmissions that reached the Tibetan Plateau through the extreme western fringe, entering perhaps through northern Pakistan, Xinjiang, into Ladakh, and then permeating into western Tibet, where they keep changing. Over time, they change. The Ladakhi ones are somewhere quite really stylistically halfway between the Upper Tibetan mascoids and the Siberian mascoids. Quite interesting. Here's a boulder full of mascoids, Bronze Age, conventionally dated in the North Inter-Asian context to the between about 2000 and 1000 BC. If they're clearly very heavily repatinated art. It's of great antiquity, and if those dates certainly would not surprise me as holding true also for the Tibetan mascoids. We also have chariots. I've also discovered many chariots in western Tibet. The first chariots were actually discovered in early 2000s by a Tibetan team in in the eastern portion of Upper Tibet. And then since then I've found about 5 different sites. It is 5 different sites, over 20 different chariots. Quite interesting. In Ladakh there's only 1 or 2, so the largest concentration of chariots is in the northwestern part of Tibet, probably a conduit with other areas of Inter-Asia, particularly Xinjiang acting as maybe a clearinghouse or a staging area for northern customs traditions to permeate one way or another, either through demic transference, ideological transference, etc., etc. The transmissions are not very clear. If I have time, I'll talk a little about my theoretical ideas, but I don't think we'll have so much time for that. We also have what seem to be later chariots. We looked this morning a bit at the Shonung chariots, which are also the later type. These are multi-spoked, perhaps having something to do with contact with other groups, and perhaps even the Han Dynasty that came close to western Tibet, according to literary sources, but did not seem to have come onto the plateau at that time. Here's from some of our colleagues' work here. You can see the chariots, of course, and the mascoids, so-called mascoids, in the North Inter-Asian context. We also have Eurasian animal style art, conventionally dated to the Iron Age. I think these dates hold for Tibet. In Tibet, though, it seems to be quite a repository, and customs and traditions that enter or spawn there tend to be recycled and used over a great amount of time, though I think this is an authentic example on the right of an Iron Age Tibetan branch of the animal style, probably having to do with Scythic in that area. The Sakas, maybe perhaps pre-Saka groups that existed in Xinjiang and the southern Tarim, may have been responsible for the context that led to the creation of this kind of rock art. This rock art is only found in northwestern Tibet and in Ladakh. It didn't spread to other areas of Upper Tibet, which leads me to consider that it had to do with actual movements of people, and it was injected into Tibet, but did not really become naturalized over a wide area. These are probably antelopes, so we find in Tibet the animal styles not only for stags, but also for antelope, yaks, wild yaks, the yak being the most common animal in the rock art of Upper Tibet. More yaks in the Eurasian animal style. Here we have from works of our good colleagues here, examples from Mongolia. Other examples from Mongolia, from our colleagues here, good colleagues. These are carved deer on what are pales found in funerary context in the Tarim Basin. We can see deer, the one on the right is quite like the ones in Tibet. The one on the left is much more like the deer you find in Mongolia. It's almost as if Xinjiang, not just geographically, but culturally, acted as an intermediate zone between Upper Tibet and Mongolia and other regions of the steppe. I think I only have a couple of minutes. This is a tiger pursuing a stag. Here we find the tigers in the animal style, various areas. Here we have your tigers from Mongolia. We find really quite early context for the use of the horse. It seems that the horse spread into Tibet. If these dates hold true that we have for rock art, it's an Iron Age phenomenon. Maybe even early Iron Age phenomena. We already find the use of mounted riders, archers. These pictures are not that clear, but it was a recurve bow usually. So we're finding this introduction also in Tibet of these seminal technological forms. We also have pictographs in Tibet, the early pictographs showing horsemen, etc., hunting. This is a bridle I donated to the museum years ago. It was being offered for sale in the market. It's now at the Lhasa Museum displayed there. It's one of their only Metal Age, what they call the Metal Age artifacts they have. I can't go into details now. I think I have about 2 minutes 2 minutes left, but you can see there are technological parallels with bridles from Northern Asia. This is an ornamental cheek piece, probably Tibetan, very stolid construction, heavy, very different than the Scythian ones here we see here from the various Scythic cultures. Here's an example from, again, from the good work of our friends. We see here the very different form, much more sinuous, less stolid in appearance. Things changed as they moved onto the plateau. Knives found in eastern Tibet, near the eastern central Tibet area. These were years ago. These came from the market too. I donated these to the museum. You'll see if you're familiar with Scythic bridle components, you can see all of these components. These are Tibetan, but they are very similar to ones found in Scythic context, very similar to ones found in Scythic context. The same with these mirrors. We find they're not the same, clearly not the same, but there are certain, again, if you want to use resonances or affinities with those from North Inner Asia. I can't really talk about any of this in detail. These kind of artifact classes also, those are from slab graves on the right. They're the top row, the upper row all the way across the image are from Tibet. So we find correspondences between Tibetan, what they call tokchas, and slab grave or bronze alloy artifacts. We also find animal style art in Tibet. This is a melon that's reputedly found from a tomb in Nagchu, the eastern part of Upper Tibet. These are other things that came from the market that are now in private collection, animal style art a la Tibetan. These are golden funerary masks that have come to light recently. So of course we find funerary masks also in the Inner Asian context. The Tibetan ones, the one on the right, it seems to be earlier. The date is given now by Chinese. This was found by Chinese a couple of years ago. 1st century BC, 1st century AD, so earlier than these, of course, but later than the Mycenaean ones, or clearly much later than the Egyptian ones. But there was this, if you will, Eurasian custom of golden funerary masks. Here we have from the horned headdresses used in the funerary horses buried at Pazyryk. We don't have anything yet from Tibet, but we have in the early Tibetan literature from the 7th to 10th century, an Old Tibetan language, of which I'm one of the specialists. We have many interesting textual references to masks, horns, on the use of these horses that were doma, that were used to transport the dead to the celestial afterlife. You know, and I don't want to go over, but I'll just quickly sum up. I only have a couple more slides. When you look at it, I'm just summing up the Tibetan evidence here, but this evidence, if we use the Tibetan evidence, it's much later, but we have now establishing a archaeological record, at least through artifacts, and a lot of these artifacts are unprovinced. You can see we have still many obstacles in Tibet, but we have this line, this spatial temporal line that's emerging from Scythian times to the imperial period of Tibet, 7th, 8th century. And so perhaps we can use these textual references to the funerary transport horses as a touchstone for interpretation of Mongolian and Siberian data. And you can see they're used to transfer the horses to the tail, the treatment of the mane. All of these you've seen archaeological correlates in the Prehistoric are mentioned in black and white in Tibetan texts. But 12 to 1500 years later. So that always bothered me deeply. But now as the artifacts, as I'm able to tap into more and more private collections, I can see this establishment of a certain line of cultural materials over time and space. It doesn't mean that it's exactly the same. Of course not. It's not the same culture. The people, of course not. Some of the latest studies are now saying about 11% of Tibetan genes are from Central Asia and Siberia. 84% are East Asian, 6% South Asian, at least according to one of the latest studies, 2016, Liu et al. In the American Journal of Genetics. So it doesn't seem like there's a huge demic counterpart component, but it's really hard to say because you don't have to have so much of a genetic signature to have an elite group or transference of peoples in the late Bronze Age and Iron Age into Tibet. And more work needs to be done to sort out the chronology of the haplotypes, etc. That work, of course, in the human genome is really very much in progress. But it's interesting to look at what the texts say about the deer. Deer, of course, are celestial and flying creatures in Tibetan literature. And again, the big question is, I mean, can this material from Tibetan text in Old Tibetan language, the pre or non-Buddhist textual references, are they in any way relevant to the archaeological materials that you are unearthing in Mongolia? We also have shamans in Tibet and ancient customs and traditions still in the area. Thanks to all my patrons, and thank you very much for your time.
Perhaps we can take 2 questions. Back there.
Yeah, I can speak loudly if that's okay.
We just have the mic because it's also being recorded.
So probably not surprisingly, I would really like to hear a bit more about this horse bridle that you showed. Can you show that image again and then explain your instincts on what time period it dates to exactly? And it seemed like you maybe talked to somebody who was involved in recovering it. What more do you know about where that came from and what the story is?
Reputedly found from a grave in eastern part, Nagchu, which is in the upper Tibet, the nomadic area. It's supposed to have come from a grave by grave robbers. There's conservation, I can't even touch on that subject, but it's very abysmal, to say the least, in Tibet. And so there's a huge industry of robbing tombs and selling artifacts on. This was a man with a bag moving through the bazaar in impunity. That's how it works in Tibet, or it did until recently. And he wanted to sell this bridle, and I saw that it was important. It's not strung the way it probably should be. You see the Polara plates, they certainly were not aligned that way with the rest of the bridle. I showed it to Nikolai Bokovenko's work on Scythian bridles in St. Petersburg. He's of the impression, looking at the bits, etc., that this really dates from the same kind of period, from the from the Prehistoric period of Scythian bridles. I would caution that it's possible because Tibet seems to have this legacy of retaining the plateau, absorbing like a sponge, but also then acting as a refugium for ancient customs and traditions. It is certainly possible that this bridle could date later to the Protohistoric period. Very sophisticated copper and bronze alloy components, many different types of components, but clearly an eye-opener in terms of the equestrian culture, which is reflected in the text, of course.
So it's some metal pieces that somebody has cleaned and strung together?
They strung it together. There was one piece of the tong, but it didn't survive AMS pre-treatment. It looked like there was an original piece of what I've strung it together. It was strung together on just a cord that the sellers had done.
One more.
Yes, please.
You showed two, it seemed like chronologically, two distinct forms of the wheeled vehicles. One was the later, that looked like some new, the other was earlier, and there were no horses.
Actually, it's hard with these pictures. One does have drawed animals, and I believe they're horses. They often do have horses.
Do they often not have horses?
Yes, they often also do not have horses.
What's really important, I think, is that they often don't have horses. So that's pointing, I think, going back to you, Brian, William. That's one of the things I think, going back to what William is interested in.
But you can see the drawed animals here.
Yeah, but no, go to the previous one.
Yes, and they're the one on the right. You can see it's not very clear, unfortunately. I'm so sorry. They're very, very obscure rock art. But it appears to be drawed animals there too. But generally the early ones are more highly stylized, or so it seems, using, signals from the style and from the condition of the rock art.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.